and we move on to the next item on our agenda. That is the Vice President of the Commission and High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy regarding the state of play of the Middle East peace process. Let me hand the floor back to the representative of the High Representative, Mr. Dowgielewicz. Secretary of State, please take the floor.
Mr. President, Commissioner, honourable members, I want to say what I mentioned in the first debate we had this afternoon, that, as you very well know, the High Representative is actually in the region at the moment, in view of the UN General Assembly next week. There have been a number of important developments in the Middle East since High Representative Vice President Ashton briefed you on the 6th of July. The Quartet meeting in Washington on 11th July, which was held on her initiative, was an important step in this regard. It confirmed the central role that is being played by the Quartet in bringing international legitimacy to the process. It was a constructive meeting where a substantial discussion was held on how to bring the parties back to the negotiating table. It was emphasised by all that the overriding objective is a resumption of negotiations. The parties need to be committed to a meaningful process that will produce results. Unfortunately, the conditions remain such that this has not yet been possible, but all Quartet members are striving to achieve this objective. In the weeks that followed, the High Representative Vice President ensured that the momentum was retained, both in contacts with the Quartet partners as well as with the parties. To this end, on 27 to 29 of August, the High Representative was once again in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Her visit, the latest in a series to the region this year, was aimed at once again demonstrating her commitment and that of the EU to the peace process, continuing her efforts to help the parties resume negotiations. This was a message she reiterated in her meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ministers Barak and Lieberman, as well as with President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad. She also wanted to express the unity of the EU in its approach, as well as its openness towards any ideas and opportunities that may be helpful to the process. The EU has repeatedly argued that the changes that have been witnessed in the neighbourhood, including changes in the countries around Israel, and add urgency to the need to find a solution that will enable the people of Israel and the people of Palestine to live in peace and security together. It is useful to recall that the EU has adopted a comprehensive position on the parameters on which it considers the negotiations should be based. This is not an attempt by the EU to establish preconditions, but rather a framework to allow meaningful negotiations to resume. In fact, the basic tenet of the EU position is that it would be able to accept any agreement that is reached freely by the parties. Although you will be familiar with this position, I think that it is useful to briefly outline these elements once again. An agreement on the borders of the two states that is based on June 4, 1967 lines, with equivalent land swaps as may be agreed between the parties. Second, security arrangements that for Palestinians respect the sovereignty and show that the occupation is over, and for Israelis protect the security, prevent the resurgence of terrorism and deal effectively with new and emerging threats. Thirdly, a just, fair and agreed solution to the refugee question. Fourthly, fulfilment of aspirations of both parties for Jerusalem. A way must be found through negotiations to resolve the status of Jerusalem as the future capital of both states. Of course, you will be aware that the Palestinians, with the support of the Arab group, have declared the intention to take up the issue of the status at the United Nations. The consistent EU position was and remains that all efforts should focus on the resumption of negotiations. We will base our reaction on any resolution on two basic elements. First of all, it is crucial that we maintain the unity that has characterised EU efforts on the peace process over the past months. It is clear that this has strengthened our position. The second factor is that any initiative at the UN should be constructive and aimed at achieving a return to negotiations. If this is the case, we should be prepared to engage and to contribute in any way that we can. Those basic elements have been thoroughly discussed during the informal Gimnish meeting of the foreign ministers in Sopot in Poland on September 2nd and 3rd, where the High Representative also briefed on her visit to the region. Of course, the ministers took this opportunity to The ministers took this opportunity to exchange views on the various aspects presented by this situation, even if there is no proposal as yet. While it might be tempting to speculate over the repercussions of the various scenarios, it would be more prudent to react to a solid proposal. There was solid agreement on the fact that the EU unity is crucial. Ministers reiterated their support of the High Representative's efforts and gave their backing to her endeavours. Since the Gimnish meeting, the High Representative has remained in constant contact with all the parties involved in this issue. She has decided before going to New York for the UN General Assembly to have another round of discussions in Cairo, taking advantage of a special meeting of the Arab League and in Israel, where she is right now. With all her different interlocutors, she has reaffirmed the urgency of relaunching the peace negotiations and underlined the need to find a way out of the present stalemate. In spite of the many difficulties that remain, the EU can still play a useful role in bridging the gap between the different partners and helping to define a possible compromise. And the High Representative has every intention to keep up the EU responsibilities at a crucial moment for the whole Middle East. No one can doubt that any compromise is going to be a very complicated goal to reach, but the EU cannot renounce what many have described as its moral obligation in striving for peace and reconciliation. Irrespective of how matters evolve, I should express concern at the financial stability of the Palestinian Authority. The EU and Member States remain committed contributors, but the situation is critical. Other donors have not yet fulfilled the pledges, and we should make every effort to encourage them to do so. The EU is on record as having recognised that the Palestinian institutions have achieved a level of preparedness that is sufficient to support the obligations of statehood. This is the result of the vision and very hard work of Palestinian leaders who have been able to accomplish this with a great deal of support and expertise provided by the EU, among others. We are therefore duty-bound to ensure that what has been achieved will not be needlessly lost. Thank you very much.
Köszönjük szépen, államtitkár úr.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. And now we're going to move on to the speakers on behalf of the groups. The first speaker is Mr. Salafranca. Thank you very much, President, Representative of the Presidency Office, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. We have been showing a great deal of interest in the Arab Spring, as we've demonstrated in the debate we just had on Libya and on Syria, but that shouldn't distract our attention from the situation in the Middle East. And above all, given the fact that there's a forthcoming United Nations General Assembly about to take place, you can look at this from the outside, and obviously you can have a simplified approach as to what the UN General Assembly can achieve when it comes to the peace process, and any change to the status quo does count and counts a lot. You also look at it also from the internal point of view, of the EU. When it comes to the external prospect, the peace process, as the representative of the Presidency Office has said, is blocked, is deadlocked, and efforts there is a lot of anger in the Middle East. That's shown by the invasion of the Israeli embassy in Egypt, and then of course President Obama is going to have difficulties in meeting the promises he's made in the speech in Cairo because of the situation internally in the United States, but also as a consequence of the electoral process that he's going to have to face up to very soon. So, President, in politics, what isn't possible is wrong. And if you look at the motion of resolution, well, I think we have been preparing ourselves for the adoption of a motion of resolution that will improve the status of Palestine within the UN, and I think this leads on to the internal approach. What's important is the EU can express its views on very sensitive issues and with a single voice. Experience we've had within the organisation, within the UN, have not been very glorious in the past, and it's true that obviously we've used the new mechanisms that provided by the Lisbon Treaty. Now we've got to concentrate all our efforts on achieving three goals. Firstly, that we make progress in the peace process and that we unblock the status quo, that's the lack of negotiations, and that we don't want to jeopardise the possibilities of making progress in that direction, and we don't want to offend the dignity of any of the two conflicting parties. President, I believe that the big advantage of the trump card of this European Union is a great ability to deal with this sort of diplomacy. So I would I know that the High Representative is making great diplomatic efforts, so the European Union, when it comes to this sensitive issue, doesn't show itself to be split once again, so that the EU can be united and make an active contribution to pushing this peace process forward. Thank you very much.
Köszönjük szépen, képviselő úr, a szocialista.
Thank you very much, honourable member. And now, on behalf of the Socialists, we have Mrs. De Keyser. 3 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a week's time, President Abbas will ask the United Nations to recognize the Palestinian state. It's a historic moment which requires us Europeans to take on the responsibility. Europe has always supported a two-state solution, with Jerusalem as the capital of two states, since the recognition of the State of Israel in 1948. Europe has helped to build up Palestinian institutions, partly thanks to the Fayyad plan to build credible Palestinian institutions. The time has come, therefore, to take a further leap forward. And this necessary diplomatic step is to do what the Palestinians deserve, what they have a right to, and what they have to believe in, that is to recognize their state. It's true, some people will say, it's not what the USA wants. President Obama, however, is busy with his re-election, and therefore there is no particular reason for the EU to follow the US line. There are those who say it won't make any difference. That's precisely why we need to get people back to the negotiating table as quickly as possible. It's much better to have a negotiation with two fully fledged partners on opposite sides of the table. There are those who will say that we will risk being disunited. Well, whose fault is that? We in the European Parliament are not the voice of the European governments. We represent the people. According to Haaretz, the Israeli people are not as opposed to an independent Palestinian state as is alleged. So let's help the process along and let us restore our credibility. We support Libya, we support Tunisia, we support Egypt. We regret the loss of life in Syria. And yet what about the Arab Spring in Palestine? It's the voice of independence, the voice of diplomacy and the voice of peace that wants to be heard in the United Nations. We don't want a return to violence in the Middle East. Here we have an opportunity to achieve peace. There is momentum out there, and we need to make the most of it, and that is my group's position. Thank you.
Köszönjük, képviselő asszony. Most pedig a...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, honourable member. The next speaker.
Monsieur the cartoon during the speech of Mrs. Véronique de Keyser. You saw me and you still ignored me. So I think you know that the rules should be respected, and permit me before the other guy to speak.
I did not see you. I apologize.
Your colleagues have seen you, have seen me.
So, two cases of blue card.
I would like to ask my colleague Véronique de Keyser, how does the proclamation of independence of Palestinian help restart of the negotiations and bringing the two parties at the same table to resume negotiations? Thank you.
Please, if you want to answer.
Je dirais à mon collègue Pascu qu'il ne s'agit.
What I'd say to Mr. Pashku is that this is not a declaration of independence by Palestine. That's been around for a while. It's a request by the Palestinians to be recognized as members of the United Nations. Once a state joins the United Nations, it has obligations. It has access to the International Court of Justice, certain treaties. It gives a certain parity in negotiations. It also places the negotiations in a multilateral context. By rebalancing the relationship between the two interlocutors, that might actually help the process along. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the floor is yours, Mrs. NEYTS-UYTTEBROECK, in the name of the Liberals and Democrats. You have 2.5 minutes.
Yes, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Commissaire.
President, Commissioner, representative from the President in Office of Council. It's always interesting to see a little debate take place within a political group, because often, obviously, you don't have enough time to sit down and have a chat, and that's why you've taken advantage of this circumstance. Having said that, I think that the majority of you in my group, although it may not be shared by everyone across the group, I think that that's important to say. So this is one of the views, and I would like to thank Mr. Dowgielewicz, if that is the correct pronunciation, for having basically explained to the House in very clear terms, or at least for those who follow these matters, what we are trying to do, what we are. You were right to mention the meeting of the Quartet on the 6th of July last, when it was decided to do everything to get a resumption of negotiations. But of course, since then, there's been no forward movement, to say the least. And this is why we are now confronted with a possible Palestinian initiative. And if I understand this correctly, negotiations are underway all over the place in an attempt to get this request from the Palestinian Authority into a format which will guarantee unanimity among the member states. And of course we support that effort. We hope that will come to pass. But can I also say in very clear terms that as far as I'm concerned, and as far as many of my colleagues are concerned, if this were to fail, if this endeavour were to fail, and if the General Assembly of the UN were to receive a request which was quite clearly for recognition of Palestine as a sovereign independent state, then I hope that a majority of member states of the Union, if not all of them, will continue to support the position which has been since the start of last year, and which you have recalled, representative of the President in office. You have set out what the details of that were. Now let's be clear. We cannot and must not ask of the Palestinians that they pay the price of the EU. It's for us to pay our own way, and it's not for them to pay in our stead. Thank you very much.
Köszönöm szépen, képviselő asszony, most pedig...
Thank you very much. And we're moving group, and Mrs. Brandner has the 1.5 minutes. Well, we're in a very delicate situation. Everyone saw this coming, but we still haven't got an answer to it. And by answer, I mean direct negotiations. The Palestinians have a right to their state and to belong to international organisations, and the World Bank has confirmed that the efforts that they've made have been successful. When it comes to the question of membership, there isn't a simple no, and there isn't a simple yes either to their request. But let me say something about the present situation, and that is that when it comes to the General Assembly, they'll probably see a motion for a resolution which would actually sort of revalue the status of the Palestinian Authority, to have a status like that of the Vatican. And I hope at least all member states will be able to say yes to that. Of course, a lot depends on the contents of the text. It depends on the substance of this text. And it's up to the EU to actually use its powers and use its influence, but only work if all 27 speak with a single voice. And I quite understand you quietly when you say you're waiting to see which text comes. Of course, it depends on us what sort of text arises. It's our task on behalf of the 27 to use our weight. The Americans can't do it. They're out of the game. It's up to us as European players to shape the text in such a way that we can agree, and I think and to ensure that we get a good majority behind it in the General Assembly. And this text, which is acceptable to many, should, in my view, contain 4 points. Firstly, and I'll say it in English,
statement on the supporting Israel alongside a Palestinian state, its legitimacy and permanence. Second, parameters that address certain Israeli concerns, previous resolutions like 181. Thirdly, a separate clarification and reiteration by Europe of its commitment to Israel's security. And lastly, I think there should be a possible timetable for membership which should be outlined in such a resolution. I thank you.
Köszönjük szépen, most pedig az európai...
Thank you very much. And now we're moving on to the ECR group. Mr.
Vielen Dank. Im Nahen Osten erwartet man im Nahen Osten erwartet man von Europa politische Präsenz. Das vergessen wir zu oft. Insbesondere vergessen wir, dass die religiöse Freiheit wichtig ist, insbesondere dort, wo es zu politischen Veränderungen.
Mimo to radykalna część islamu chce ich usunięcia ze społeczeństwa. Na przykład w Iraku.
For example, in Iraq, Christians cannot have their own schools, can't build churches or publish books. They are second-class citizens in their own country. There are religious purges conducted by radicals across the country.
For a moment, the interpretation is missing.
Right.
Freedom is understood to mean religious freedom under Sharia law. That's, however, not the definition of religious freedom under international law, which allows the building of places of worship, the publication of religious publications, and so on. We should bear this in mind in everything we do concerning that region of the world. Thank you.
Köszönjük szépen, képviselő, pedig az...
Thank you very much. And now, representative of the GUE group, Mr. Triantaphyllides. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. President, on the 23rd of September, the President of the Palestinian Authority will go to the General Assembly of the United Nations seeking recognition of the state of Palestine. Now, they are doing this after lengthy attempts to meet their requirements under the Quartet, and recognition of a state by the international body will give a boost to the resumption of negotiations with Israel, which have been at a deadlock for some time now. As is well known, the Quartet, to which the EU is party, has signed up to a two-state solution by September 2011. One country, Israel, is there, and the Palestinians have now implemented their programme by President Fayyad, and now they hope that as a recognised state community, we will be able to see negotiations with Israel on an equal footing to get a viable solution to the problem. Now, quite apart from the politics of this, upgrading the status of the Palestinians would be helpful for the solving of other bilateral issues such as security, the safety of the waters, and the status of Jerusalem. The position of the European Union is that we support the Palestinian demands, but that promoting this must take place in a timely way, and for a variety of reasons is now. Thank you very much.
Köszönjük szépen, képviselő úr. Most pedig a szabadság.
Thank you very much, honourable member, and now I'll give the floor to Mr. Belder.
2,5 perc.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, can I put two questions to the Polish presidency as regards the unilateral Palestinian diplomatic initiatives. As co-signers of the Oslo II agreements, the EU signed up to the peace process, peace negotiations with the parties to the conflict in the Middle East. Now, why are EU members shrinking from their solemn international obligations? Because they said that they should now speak out against a clear violation by one of the parties to the agreement, quite apart from other member states which, according to the press, seem to be lining up to support the Palestinian plan in their various ways. I'd like to hear from the Council what is Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, whereby in the event of Palestinian success at the United Nations, this upgrading internationally will be used against Israel using international UN bodies such as the International Criminal Court. Now, that, I think, is not going to help I'm asking, is that going to help the peace process in the Middle East? I don't think so. Now, secondly, there has been, can I put this question to Council and Commission? There has been alarming verbal aggression on the part of Turkish leaders, which is raising tensions in the Middle East. Now, what does Council and Commission think about the rejection of the legality of the the blockade of the Gaza Strip? There have been threats by Prime Minister Erdogan about the increased presence of the Turkish fleet in that part, in the east of the Mediterranean. This is a country which is seeking to be taken into EU membership, and Prime Minister Erdogan is saying that any criticism of Israel is interpreted by them as being anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic. Now, it's important to look at the national media in that country and combat all evidence of anti-Semitism. I think that if it comes to the Jewish minority in Turkey, that's a country where anti-Semitism is actually normal and is commonplace. And we're talking about the Arab Spring, and we're talking about the Turkish contribution. And I think I'd like to hear from the Council and the Commission what they think about the Turkish contribution. Thank you.
And now I'd like to give the floor to the non-attached member, Mr. Griffin. You have the floor.
€1 billion every year. That's the amount of taxpayers' money that the European Commission and Member States give to the Palestinian Authority. €1 billion a year to a corrupt regime that does very little for its own people, while ordinary voters in our countries are crushed by rising taxes and inflation. It's unreal. Worse than that, EU policy is based on the false concept that a two-state solution is workable. It might have been once, but it's too late now. The Palestinians are geographically dispersed. Over 2 million live east of the 1947 armistice lines, 1 million in Gaza and about 1 million in Israel. In the occupied territories, the illegal Zionist settlement programme has sliced their land into disjointed parcels. Even if all the territories conquered in 1967 were included, Palestine would still be only 22% of the territory of the current Greater Israel. It would be an economic basket case forever reliant on foreign aid handouts. The two-state solution sounds pretty, but is simply not realistic. Yet again, the EU is throwing money at a policy doomed to failure. We must accept that we cannot solve every problem in the world. We should turn our attention and money to solving our own. Let's face it, thanks to the euro disaster, this place isn't going to run out of problems. The EU meddling in the Holy Land isn't only stealing money from overtaxed British families. Combined with even more massive US aid for Israel, it encourages both sides to refuse to get serious about sorting out their own differences. None of it helps real people. It's a counterproductive waste of €1 billion a year. Thank you.
Köszönjük szépen, képviselő úr, ezzel árult a
Thank you very much. And now we've come to the end of the round of group speakers. Now we'll take Mrs. Oomen-Ruijten from the EPP, 1.5 minutes.
President, way back in July, I put a question to Baroness Ashton saying what was going to happen with the EU, what was going to be the EU position vis-à-vis the Palestinian demands. The truth is that the EU is divided. Certainly in the short term. We're talking here about a two-state solution on the basis of the 67 borders with Jerusalem as a shared capital. Now I can understand, President, the Palestinian position and their desire to get rapid recognition because negotiating is impossible. There are too many settlements and the Israelis are continuing with the settlements despite all the demands that they relent. And this means that and I say this to colleagues, when it comes to negotiations and a Palestinian state, this was simply something which, that was the only thing which they could really go for. I think what we need to do now, President, is for Abbas to get something from us. We can't come with empty arms. And we must guarantee that there is a compromise solution available on the table. We want to improve the situation for the Palestinians. President, in the Middle East, and Mr. Belder, I think, would accept this. At present, Israel stands alone. And it's very difficult for me because I was raised as a good European with every sympathy for the Promised Land. But what we see, if we can look, is that something has to be done now because we cannot delay. That's not an option, and a compromise among the Europeans is much needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Please stick to your speaking time. And now I give the floor to Mr. De Rossa. You have 2 minutes.
We are 60 seconds to midnight. Members don't need me to rehearse the conflicts that are underway and those bubbling under the surface. The Arab Spring and its potential for a great leap forward can only be fully realised when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and occupation is resolved. In this regard, Europe has to be consistent if we are to retain any shred of credibility with those who are struggling to construct a better way of governing themselves and providing a better life for their children. We all know that a negotiated two-state solution is the optimum solution. Palestinians decided over 20 years ago to accept a Palestinian state on the 1967 Green Line, 22% of their historic homeland, with Jerusalem as a shared capital with Israel. Despite this historic compromise, Israel's current leadership refuses to engage, demanding negotiations without Palestinian preconditions, while laying down its own preconditions, such as continued colonisation of Palestinian land and rejecting President Obama's basis for negotiations. President Abbas therefore has no option but to make a broad appeal to the international community through the United Nations in order to maintain his non-violent political and diplomatic strategy for an end to the conflict. All EU member states support the establishment of a Palestinian state on the 1967 lines, and we have agreed that the PA is ready for statehood, so no major principle is involved. By voting for an upgrading of the State of Palestine in the United Nations, we will, however, reinforce the non-violent strategy of President Abbas. To do otherwise will shred our reputation in the region. I urge the European External Action Service to strain every sinew to negotiate a resolution with the Palestinians which unites EU member states in support of President Abbas's initiative, which reassures both Palestinians and Israelis regarding their core concerns and seeks to create the potential for revived, time-limited final status negotiations. That could possibly stop the clock. Thank you.
Köszönöm, képviselő úr. Most pedig Rinaldi képviselő.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rinaldi.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Minister, Mr. Nicolai, Commissioner. I think there are three things that we can be certain about. The first one is that there is this deep friendship that we have with the Palestinian people, people that's suffering every day. You need to go to visit the occupied territories to see the daily suffering of the Palestinians, and the international community has to do something for them. We owe them that. And then there's this link that we have with Israel as Europeans. That's a very strong link. It's probably stronger than any other link we have with a third country outside the EU, because Israel constitutes a crucial part of the cultural and moral identity of Europe. It's part of our family. And the third certainty, unfortunately, is that Europe is always split or is always very conservative in its positions, and so there are constraints which also affect this vote in the UN, and probably another humiliating opportunity for us, given the absence of European policy during the Libyan crisis. But everything depends on us, Minister, Commissioner, and the European citizens are asking for a qualitative step forward, a unified position for the whole of Europe, and hopefully a position in favour of this declaration of independence. A lot of Israeli people are actually asking for this in contrast to their government, and it's because of a basic feeling of justice and fairness. Support for independence will actually be in line with the reality of Palestine, that it exists. Whatever you say, you can't wipe it off the map. Its independence is being strengthened every day, and the national feeling is being strengthened, and this is because of the occupation. And secondly, what we'd also see is the security and the identity of Israel will be enhanced as well. The security would be much better guaranteed by two states with secure and certain borders, and we should ask this of the leaders of Israel. Perhaps in 20 years' time there will just be one single state, but at the moment there are the stagnant waters of European diplomacy, negotiations which are not going anywhere. We hope there's not a breakdown. If there's a breakdown, then really we will be determined, we will end up being peripheral in Europe, not just economically peripheral, but politically peripheral.
Megadott időt.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask members to speak to stay to their time? Thank you very much, President. The continuation of colonization of settlements in Palestine has led negotiations to an impasse, to a deadlock. That's why the Palestinians are looking for recognition in the UN in order to be credible. And we are full of tergiversations. We are humming and hawing, and we should take up an independent position, self-standing, and assert ourselves on the international stage. Now, after a recent poll, the majority of French citizens and German and British as well feel that the Palestinians are entitled to a state which should be admitted to the UN as of now. And we represent European citizens. The democratic reveille in the Arab world creates a new context which may well relaunch the peace process aspirations on the part of young people are the same wherever you are, in Cairo, Tunisia, Ramallah and Gaza. If we abandon the Palestinians, then despair may give rise to a new intifada, and that would be down to us, our responsibility. This is an historic opportunity available to the European Union. It should encompass recognition of a state of Palestine in its support policy for the Arab Spring area, rather than pressurising the Palestinian Authority to oblige it to renounce the status of a full state in the UN. And also it should act vis-à-vis the Israeli government so that they at long last respect international law and its tenets. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next is Mr. Van Dalen. You have 90 seconds. Thank you, President. The peace process in the Middle East is in a sorry state. The Palestinian Authority next week is going to go to the UN seeking a proclamation of a Palestinian state. That's unilateral, and that doesn't bring a viable solution any closer. On the contrary, now we are big financiers of the Palestinian Authority. We should use the leverage we have to force Abbas to go back to the negotiating table. Solutions to the process can be made only at the table of negotiations, with an input, a contribution from all the parties concerned, in particular the Palestinians. Now, there are dangers to peace in the Middle East at present, and I think that Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan is one of them. I think that he is talking the language of war, belligerent language, and is organising blockades to break the legitimate and the lawful blockade of Gaza. And this takes us back to the flotilla in 2010. And Mr. Erdogan is now threatening and pushing the creation of a Palestinian state. That man is a clear risk, a danger to the peace process in the Middle East. And we cannot take him seriously as an interlocutor, as a partner. And this should put paid to any attempt by Turkey to get membership of the European Union. Thank you very much.
OOMEN-RUIJTEN.
Voorzitter, ik zou graag van...
Can I hear from Mr. Van Dalen whether he can explain to the House why it's not the settlements that is the problem, and that's keeping the parties away from the table of negotiations, because that's what, and the responsibility there is one of the Israelis, not the Palestinians. It's not them that are pushing the settlements. Can you explain to me why that is?
Ja, voorzitter, ik had...
Yes, Mr. President. I think that if Mrs. OOMEN-RUIJTEN had listened to my speech, she would not have had to ask that question. I was saying two things. First of all, at present, the crux of the debate lies in the Palestinian Authority. They're pushing for the creation of a Palestinian state. They're causing a danger to the process, and in a way which could give rise to escalation. And then secondly, had you listened, you would have heard me say that all parties must return to the negotiating table, because that's where a solution can be found to all the problems which exist. And I made those 2 points crystal clear. Thank you very much.
Yes, but I didn't get an answer on my question. I wanted to know what the effect is of the settlement politics of the Israelis, and that answer I didn't get in his speech nor in his answer now.
Nincs lehetőség, no possibility to answer. So we continue with MEP Murphy.
Ik heb namelijk in mijn speech duidelijk aan...
Mr. Van Dalen, I said clearly that the two have to go back to the negotiating table in order to discuss all the issues. And that's the place where a decision can be taken on one of the things. That is one of a long list of problems, Mrs. OOMEN-RUIJTEN, which required discussion. And that's where they should be raised, and not via a detour in the UN with the recognition or proclamation of a Palestinian state. Blue card, Mr. Obermayr.
Das abzustellen. Die Dame, die...
No, Please stop this. One blue card is allowed. You can't allow the lady over there to keep taking the floor. This is a very important issue, but everybody should have the opportunity to put a question. Everybody should have a chance to take the floor. I think this game is unacceptable. Please stop that. Everybody should follow the same rules. Thank you.
Yes, I accept the critic. I accept the critic. We cannot make a debate here. We continue with MEP Murphy. 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Many people in the occupied territories in the Middle East, around the world, have a hope that the vote at the UN will contribute in some way to ending the horrific oppression which the Palestinian people face. Unfortunately, whichever way the vote goes, their suffering will continue. There have been hundreds of resolutions, many condemning Israeli aggression, resolutions recognising, supporting independent Palestinian state at the UN. Successive Israeli governments have simply ignored them. What I think is needed to bring about change is mass action, a third intifada by the Palestinian people, against the blockade of Gaza, against roadblocks, against the apartheid wall, against incursions by the Israeli army, and against the occupation itself. In recent months, there has been a magnificent movement in Israel, with young people, working class people, participating in a social movement demanding social justice. 450,000 people demonstrating 2 weeks ago. I would raise that movement should also take up the question of the oppression of their Palestinian brothers and sisters. Such a development would open up the prospect of forging a powerful alliance of the Palestinian masses, the Israeli workers together, fighting against their common enemy, the Israeli establishment, fighting for socialist change in the region, socialist Israel and a socialist Palestine. Thank you.
Blue card, Mr. De Rossa.
Could I ask Paul Murphy for a direct reply to a simple question? Does he support the proposal of President Abbas for recognition of a Palestinian state in the United Nations? Yes or no?
Please, Mr. Murphy.
I support the democratic right of the Palestinian people, the Palestinian Authority, to be recognised in the UN. I support the question of observer status. I would go further than that, but I don't think as a tactic it is the correct method to go in terms of achieving liberation for the Palestinian people. I think emphasis has to be placed on building a movement of the Palestinian masses, of taking the inspiration from the Arab Spring, the revolutions, the power of ordinary people when mobilised to overthrow dictators, to bring about significant change, and also for that movement to link up with ordinary people within Israel.
Köszönöm szépen. Következő hozzászóló Provera.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Provera, who has 90 seconds.
Thank you, President. Everyone is convinced of the need to create two states that can coexist in peace, but the difference of opinion is just over how to achieve that goal. The intention of the Palestinian Authority to unilaterally request of the United Nations recognition as a state is an initiative which, in my view, could damage the peace process, and it could lead to chain reactions in the Middle East. Obviously, the aim is to diplomatically isolate Israel and face it with a fait accompli. But the peace agreements with Egypt are now being threatened by extremist positions, and relations with Turkey are in crisis. The episode of the attack on the Israeli embassy in Cairo is the last link in this chain. So this unilateral Palestinian measure runs counter to the principle recognised by both parties, and that is that the only solution to the conflict is bilateral negotiations between the two sides. And a unilateral recognition could therefore create further instability, actually make it more difficult to create a democratic Palestinian state that would live in peace with Israel. And so it's desirable, in my view, to go back to the fundamental principles of the Oslo Agreement, based on mutual recognition, peaceful coexistence, security and political rights. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Provera.
Thank you very much, Mr. Provera. As you know, the screens are broken. The screens have broken down. So what I'm going to do is call out the next speaker's name and then also announce the next two so that people don't miss their turn. So now I'll give the floor to Mrs. Dodds for 1 minute, and after that we have Mr. Pöttering and then Mrs. Toya. So Mrs. Dodds, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am perturbed but not surprised by the lack of leadership shown by the External Action Service on this issue. I've listened very carefully to the representative of the Presidency, and there are many issues we agree on, principally the need to get back to the negotiating table, because it is only there that a full and lasting settlement can actually come forward. However, despite endless meetings and the lateness of the hour, we still have no position from the EU. President Obama this week reiterated the US position that if this issue reaches the Security Council, then use their veto in that forum. However, the representative of the Presidency, and I hope I quote correctly, says that only the EU can play a useful role in bridging the gap. Surely we are entitled to greater clarity and a much more direct answer. And I ask you again, does the Polish Presidency, does the Commission believe that the declaration of an independent Palestinian state at the UN will contribute to a positive outcome of negotiation and stability in the region?
Thank you, Mrs. Dodds. And now Mr. Pöttering has the floor, and after him Mrs. Toya and then Mrs. Ries. So Mr. Pöttering first.
Mr. President, colleagues, the people in the Arab world are fighting for freedom and democracy. Essentially, it's all about dignity, and that's the case with Israel and Palestine as well. And that is why we seek Israel within safe borders, Palestine within safe borders, two countries coexisting in peace. We defend Israel against all forms of terrorism, but Israel's long-term security is at risk if we do not recognize an independent Palestinian state. In other words, in future, Israel's security is only guaranteed if there is a Palestinian state next door. Best of all would be if recognition of Palestinian membership of the UN were a result of negotiation. But there's a prerequisite for that. According to Peace Now, an Israeli NGO, since the settlement moratorium in October 2002, Israel has been building twice as many houses on Palestinian territory as on Israeli territory. In other words, Palestinian land is being taken away, that same land that would form the rock bed of a Palestinian state. This is misguided because Israel is ending up in isolation. The settlements are illegal, and if Israel doesn't stop building settlements, then there is no other hope than for Palestine to be recognized in the United Nations. I'm going to conclude, Mr. President. President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad are men of peace. Israel will regret not making peace with these people. We should not hurt the Palestinian soul or the dignity of the Palestinian people. So Israel in safe borders, Palestine in safe borders. The dignity of Palestinians is the same as that of Israelis.
Thank you very much, President Pöttering. Let's have a look now. Mrs. Toya. Is Mrs. Toya in the chamber? I can't see Mrs. Toya. So I'll give the floor to Mrs. Ries, and after that Mrs. Brepoels, and then Mr. Stevenson. Mrs. Ries, you have the floor.
President, recognition of a Palestinian state is legitimate, and we support that demand. However, I also believe that a solution to the problems of the Middle East also must involve a resumption of negotiations. And we know that with Oslo, unilateral acts have never advanced the cause of peace. the mediator, the envoy for Mr. Martel for Council with the quartet, has said this, as did Baroness Ashton. Negotiations are the way to get progress, and the representative of Council said that in his introductory remarks today. Now, some colleagues, some member states, are giving full support a priori to this Palestinian initiative. Now this, to date, hitherto, the framework and everything else is on the table, and it's a kind of blank check for a united Palestine, which is not in line with realities on the ground, where you've got enemy brothers and reconciliation. My fear is that unilateralism will do lasting damage to reconciliation, will mean there's no space for compromise, will perpetuate non-negotiated red lines, and the Palestinians will not be able to budge or to move, and this will become a sterile political impasse, which is what the foreign ministers have said only recently. In the absence of an EU position, it's because, why is that the case? It's because there's no text. Madame de Keyser, other speakers have said, there is no resolution just a few days before the announcement. And much will depend on a text, on the Europeans being able to persuade the Palestinians to put into that and not to. In other words, what instruments will be available to the European Union? And we've got to get our act together. That's the difficulty, that's the ambition, the challenge which lies ahead. Now, that text is going to be very late in the day, but let's hope it does enable the EU to play its part in full, because a two-state negotiated solution is what we must go for. I believe in dialogue, President. It's difficult, of course, and there are conflicts ahead, no doubt, but it must be without the settlements.
Thank you, Mrs. Ries. Mrs. Kiil-Nielsen has been waving a blue card. Mrs. Ries, do you accept a question from her? Ms. Ries, do you accept this question from Mrs. Kiil-Nielsen? Yes, fine. Mrs. Kiil-Nielsen, you have the floor. I raised the blue card just now, but you didn't see it, because I wanted to put a question to Mr. Provera, but now I put it to Mrs. Ries, because they both use the same term several times. That is the term unilateral, and I'd like them to explain what they mean by this adjective, and also I'd like them to tell you how they define the construction of hundreds of kilometers of security wall, how they define the construction of hundreds of houses in occupied territories by Israel, and I'd like them to explain how they can talk about a unilateral measure when they know that this initiative for the recognition of the Palestinian state is supported by 130, 140 states in the world. So I'd like to, so there's some definitions of vocabulary. That's clear. Mrs. Ries, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, President. I'll be very brief. I have given my views on the question of the card. I've got the rules to hand, but it's a matter of regret. And it's typical in these emotive debates on the Middle East and other things that the card becomes a kind of alibi, a fig leaf for confrontations which are not really connected to what people are saying. And responding to points raised in the interventions, that's the whole point. But this must not become a kind of global inquisition when you can simply advance the opposite views on the subject. Now, on the question of unilateralism, now what is unilateral? I think that a negotiated solution is what we should be looking for. That's what I was doing from the start to the end of my speech. And on the question of settlements as well. Surely, President, I can answer the question. I don't know how long I have to do so, but surely I should get the same amount of time as the questioner.
Now, the problem is that when it comes to blue cards and the answers, you both just have 30 seconds each. In any case, your answer was clear. And now I'll give the floor to Mrs. Brepoels, and after that Mr. Stevenson, and after that Mr. Ferreira. Mrs. Brepoels.
Thank you, President. After some 20 years of the peace process, I think we have to accept the fact that all efforts to get a two-state solution have now failed. And the Palestinian Authority's question, I think, is a cry of desperation, despair, to break the deadlock. Because even after recognition, which is symbolically very important, there would still need to be negotiations. However, the two parties then would be more equal, if you like. It's, of course, of the essence that there's not an image of international divisions. And I believe here that the EU must make a major push, because if you look at the UN and what Obama said to the UN last year, now, a year on, he's threatening to block process there. But I think that our representative is also very ambiguous. We talk about the Palestinian Authority being asked to refrain from their initiative and to desist, but this is really to cover up our internal divisions. We've got to use our right to speak to send out a clear signal to the United Nations, because this is the time where there must be a breakthrough. Thank you.
Thank you. Now Mr. Stevenson, then Mr. Ferreira, and then after that Mr. David. Mr. Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Chairman, can I take this opportunity to raise another matter of great urgency and great concern in the Middle East? I'm referring to Camp Ashraf in northern Iraq, home for the past quarter century to more than 3,400 Iranian dissidents who, as you know, have suffered from repeated attacks and harassment by the Iraqi authorities, culminating in a massacre on the 8th of April this year, when 36 of them were killed in cold blood, unarmed civilians. Now, as you know, Commissioner, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has given the camp's residents a deadline of the 31st December this year to clear Ashraf. The clock is now ticking rapidly, and although we have brokered a plan within the EU for resettling the residents to third countries, and indeed some EU member states and even some countries outside the EU have already started taking some of these refugees, we are running out of time, and we're facing the prospect of another violent attack and bloodshed, perhaps on a scale similar to Srebrenica. I've now received information last night from UNHCR that the residents of Ashraf are protected under international law, but can I urge the Commission to follow the example of UN High Commissioner Antonio Guterres and write to Nouri al-Maliki demanding an extension to the deadline to give us time to work on the resettlement plan, and in the meantime to give some protection by getting a UN presence in Camp Ashraf. Thank you very much.
And now I recognise Mr. Ferreira, and after him we'll have Mr. David and Mr. Siwiec. Thank you very much, President. The recognition of the State of Palestine in the borders before 1967, including East Jerusalem, and the recognition as a member of the UN with full rights, this would constitute the logical conclusion of rights that have been recognised since 1947 in all relevant UN resolutions, rights that Palestinian enjoys, almost two decades after the signing of the Oslo agreements, and indifferent to all the condemnations, the Palestinian people have been making efforts to consolidate their state. It is a just solution. It's in conformity with the international law, but there are difficulties which prevent the conclusion of successful negotiations in Israelis and Palestinians. I think the recognition of the state will be the most important contribution of the international community to ensure the effective implementation of the principle of two states, which was established 64 years ago and has never been worked on. Thank you very much, Mr. Ferreira. And now Mr. David has the floor for a minute and a half, and after him Mr. Siwiec and then Mrs. Auken. Mr. David. Thank you very much, President. We're debating the peace process in the Middle East, but there are processes underway which we haven't looked at. Perhaps, unfortunately, no. The EU has come out in favour, as many other members of the international community, for a two-state solution. I think that the Palestinians have the right, and the Israelis have the right, to live in peace. But we have to have negotiations between the two. At the moment, there have been misunderstandings between the two sides for 63 years, and unless there's a negotiated solution, these misunderstandings will continue and lead to further suffering. We need a negotiated solution for the borders based on the 67 borders, and we want land swap so that the rights of the Palestinians living in Israel will be recognised. Jerusalem should be the future capital of the two states. That should be an international symbol of the reconciliation of two people who are able to live together. This is supposed to be the land and honey, as Prophet Ezekiel said. We've also got to deal with the refugee camps in which Palestinians still live, and the Arab states and the international community should carry on paying compensation to the Palestinian refugees. It's important that a military force under the aegis of the UN and with the involvement of American Islamic forces should be placed on the territory in order to maintain peace. And what we need to do is to see a symbol of political courage and determination. Thank you very much, Mr. David. And now I'll give the floor to Mr. Siwiec for a minute and a half, and after that Mrs. Auken and then Mrs. Lösing. Mr. Siwiec.
Na tej sali nikt nie kwestionuje prawa.
Nobody in this chamber questions the Palestinians' right to have their own state. Nobody here questions the dignity of that nation. Nobody here knows whether we'll be a step closer to peace or not if Palestine is recognized in the United Nations. The question is, what sort of Palestine would be recognized? Abbas's Palestine on the West Bank, or Hamas on the Gaza Strip, where Israel has withdrawn from and from whence rockets are fired? The problem is a thorny one. In seeking to promote peace, we should not commit the sin of naivety. My colleagues say something must be done, and that something must be firmly rooted in reality. Any rash move isn't going to give the Palestinians their state or Israel peace.
Thank you. And now Mrs. Auken has the floor for 1 minute, and then Mrs. Lösing, and then Mr. Kasoulides.
Thank you very much. President, we are now confronted with a unique situation because the colleagues have made a very important point. There is a great movement afoot in North Africa and in Palestine, and we support the legitimate right of this people to live in a state with recognition. That's the only way, and we must use peaceful means. They must use peaceful means, and this is also a chance for Israel, an opportunity for Israel. The promised land could well lose out. There are all manner of religious fanatics who have taken power, and we can see what's happened, for example, with the peace flotilla. Because I hear many people in Israel say, "Come and help us. There's nothing we can do." And Europe must do what it can and meet its obligations. And this is something for the High Representative and for Council. You must support that big movement, that groundswell in North Africa and in Israel. They deserve our help.
And now for 1 minute, Mrs. Lösing, and then Mr. Kasoulides, and then Mr. KREISSL-DÖRFLER. Mrs. Lösing. In Israel as well, thousands of people are demonstrating, calling for justice and democracy, and they are showing that there is a link between their social need because of settlements and also because of very, very high military expenditure that increases their need. And now the Israeli government is turning against the Palestinian people and acting against its own people. And so we have to act now in the interest of the people in Palestine and in Israel, to also act on behalf of international peace. Now, obviously, recognising Palestine as a full member of the UN won't actually help the security of people living in Palestine or in Israel. All forces in Europe must work together to promote a two-state solution, and also political decisions have to be taken. The recognition of diplomatic representatives of Palestine in all European states as diplomats, that would improve the international status of the Palestinian people. All European countries insist on this, that the settlement policy, which is against international law, should be brought to an end. It's only the equality of Israeli and Palestinian peoples that can ensure peace and social justice for all peoples in the area, and also help marginalise extremist forces. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Lösing. And now Mr. Kasoulides has the floor for 2 minutes, and after him with Mr. KREISSL-DÖRFLER and then Mr. Gahler.
Thank you, Chairman. The EU is called upon to play an important role at the vote of a resolution at the General Assembly on the Palestinian statehood. After the success of EU countries within NATO in Libya, the relevance of the EU as an international actor will be tested if it succeeds on this occasion to have a common position, and is pivotal in arriving with a UN resolution acceptable to all, which can get the peace process going. The wording of the resolution matters. A single yes and the ensuing reactions of Israel and the American Congress risk to cause an irremediable damage to the peace process. A single no will jeopardize the credibility of the Palestinian Authority in the eyes of its own people, will encourage extremists, and will alienate further the Arab world. Perhaps upgrade Palestine to a status similar to that of the Vatican or Kosovo. Acknowledge the entitlement of the Palestinians to an independent state on the basis of 1967 borders, as described by Obama in his recent statement, as soon as all the appropriate conditions have been met. Acknowledge the entitlement of Israel to exist demographically as Jewish in character within internationally recognized borders and with all its security concerns guaranteed. Oppose all unilateral actions, including new facts on the ground and settlement expansions. Call for the resumption of direct negotiations guided by the above principles, and review the resolution in 12 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kasoulides. And now Mr. KREISSL-DÖRFLER for 1.5 minutes, and after him Mr. Gahler and then Mr. Zala. Mr. KREISSL-DÖRFLER.
President, colleagues, legitimate demand on the part of the Palestinians. I support that. A recognition by the international community, and also the right to exist for Israel. That's fine, but it's clear that long-term peace and prosperity for both Israeli and Palestinian is something which they're going to have to agree on, and that's why they've got to get back to the negotiating table. It's 5 to midnight. We've got to bring what leverage we can to bear on the Israeli government, amongst others, to make sure that they stand there as good as their word. If you look at the former ambassador to Germany, Avi Primo, today in an interview saying quite clearly that Benjamin Netanyahu for 2 years now has been promising a two-state solution, but is not moving in that direction, and the ultra-right coalition party in his government is blocking everything. And I think that there we've got to look at the Israeli government. They've got to act. It's not always frustrate the Palestinian side. I believe that we've got to do something, otherwise we'll be here in a year's time saying the same things. And I believe that there's a need for an upgrading now. Mr. Kasoulides has said this. The Vatican has that status. That's an important step. However, without negotiations, we're never going to get a sustainable peace process in the Middle East. So we have got to have a clear message from the EU. Israel must take the next step on its own initiative, otherwise there will be no peace at the end of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. KREISSL-DÖRFLER. And now I'll give the floor to Mr. Gahler for a minute and a half, and then Mr. Zala, and then Mr. Zalewski.
Herr Präsident, wir sind uns so lange als EU-Mitgliedstaat.
Thank you. We've agreed as EU member states for a long time when it comes to words. We call on both sides to come back to the negotiating table and to avoid unilateral steps. Unilateral includes recognition of Palestinian membership of the United Nations. Unilateralism is also building settlements, Israeli settlements, on Palestinian territory. I'm not sure that we necessarily treat both sides equally, and here I mean my own country, Germany. We have to think about how to encourage the international community not to ignore Israeli settlement building. I have increasingly been worried about the future of Israel's security, and I do think that in our agreements with the Israeli government we need to intervene, because that government's policy is radicalizing the region and not contributing to peace. I think recognition in the General Assembly, however big the majority, is not going to help promote the peace. So let's start with Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gahler. Mr. Gahler.
From Auken, do you accept it? Okay.
I just want to ask Mr. Gahler if he really compare illegal settlement building and all these things with a total legal approach in the United Nations, and how can he call it unilateral when it is and apply in a multilateral context? But do you really compare illegalities in Israel with a legal approach in the UN?
You know, my actual point is I want to get the peace process going again. But in order to, I know that the recognition in the Assembly will not strengthen this approach in Israel. And in order to avoid that the Israelis have another argument not to come back, I must offer the Palestinians something real in substance, and that is that we enforce the settlement stop. And that is my approach. I do not want that the settlement building continues unharmed and unpunished, and therefore I think it's the better way to pressurize for a stop of the settlements, and not for the Palestinians who want to gain something, to have something. I want them to have something in substance and not only on the paper.
Thank you, Mr. Gahler. And now, for 1 minute and a half, Mr. Zala, and then after that, Mr. Zalewski, and then Mr. Crocetta. Zala.
Ladies and gentlemen, of course, until the UN Secretary General receives an application from the Palestinians, we don't know what it will contain. What matters now is something else. And I say this because we're all talking about the future of the peace process. What is important is the position and strategy of the European Union. It isn't possible, against the spirit of the Treaty of Lisbon, to leave this matter to individual member states and to deprive the European Union of a position in its own right. In the Arab world in particular, the EU is regarded as an arbiter of international legitimacy. Soft power gives the EU great credibility. That's why Lady Ashton must work towards a single common EU position on the Palestinian application. If we achieve that, then the EU can make its own proposals to the Security Council.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thaler. And now Mr. Zalewski has the floor for a minute and a half, and after him Mr. Crocetta, and then Mr. Schöpflin. Mr. Zalewski.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, thinking about the problems in the Middle East and relations between the Palestinians and Israel, there are three big problems and issues we're dealing with. First of all, the right of Palestinians to self-determination. Secondly, Israel's right to security. And thirdly, lasting peace in the region, which is of course in the vital interest of the European Union. And in that context we should think carefully about any decision taken, including the application which has been made to the United Nations by the Palestinians. Briefly, we have to wonder if this application is going to strengthen peace. I firmly believe that the Palestinians have a right to self-determination. However, the process of creating a Palestinian state should be very much, it should take place in harmony with the negotiations designed to develop good neighbourly relations and solid cooperation with Israel. That is absolutely vital. It's not just one act of recognition, because that doesn't solve any problems. But the European Union needs to get very much involved to ensure that that act of recognition depends on success in the negotiations with Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Zalewski. And now Mr. Crocetta has the floor for a minute and a half, followed by Mrs. Schöpflin and then Mrs. ESSAYAH. Mr. Crocetta. Well, if the Arab police fire on the people, immediately there are protests in the UN. But if from Gaza there are mortars arriving in Israel and hitting Israeli towns, there's complete silence, because of course we know that Israelis can bombard the Gaza people. But nonetheless, the lack of a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the actual cause of the conflict that we see between the Arab world and the Western world. I mean, basically, this conflict is a breeding ground for extremism. And now, in North Africa and the Middle East, we've seen the Arab Spring, which brings the winds of democracy, and surely this has an influence on relations between Israel and Palestine. And the very existence of Israel is linked to the understanding of what's at stake here. Either Israel accepts the existence of a Palestinian state, or Israel will no longer be able to live under the same circumstances in this region. And this is that we need to look at this framework, and I think it would be very hypocritical were Europe not to give to the Palestinians, show them the same solidarity which is giving to those who in the Arab world and other parts of the world are giving support to those who are fighting for freedom and rights. So obviously there is a right of people to have its own territory, people have the right to self-determination, and this is an inviolable right, and I think Europe has to support the Palestinian resolution at the UN. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Crocetta. And now, for a minute and a half, Mr. Schöpflin, and then after that, Mrs. ESSAYAH, and then Mr. Svensson. Mr. Schöpflin.
Thank you, President. Most of the attention attracted by the Arab Spring has focused on internal developments, and rightly so. But from the perspective of the Middle Eastern region as a whole, it is vital to recognise that the Arab Spring is also transforming the geostrategic environment. The balance of power between Israel and its neighbours has shifted. Now, Mubarak's Egypt was committed to a policy of zero change, and this included relations with Israel. This is moving in a different direction, as hitherto marginalised political forces in Egypt are emerging. Israel, likewise, had a stable neighbour under the repressive Assad regime in Syria, where the outcome of the pressure for change remains unclear. There is no guarantee that a putative end of the Assad regime will be of benefit to Israel. At the same time, others have mentioned this, Turkey has initiated a far-reaching improvement of its links with the Arab world,
and has inevitably downgraded its relations with Israel. Now, in an ideal world, this should provide an incentive for Israel to find a settlement with the Palestinians and to do so quickly. Time is running out. I'm entirely in agreement with Mr. De Rossa here, and it is vital for Israel's future security that it come to terms with the changes. If not, it will very likely be coerced into them in much less favourable circumstances.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schöpflin. And now, for a minute and a half, Mrs. ESSAYAH, followed by Mr. Svensson, and then Mr. Koumoutsakos. Mrs. ESSAYAH.
Mr. President, Commissioner, President in Office, as a number of colleagues have already said here, we still don't know what the Palestinian representatives will be putting to the UN General Assembly. In a number of EU countries, we're already seeing the problems of a symbolic unilateral declaration of independence. The danger is that there would be a logjam in the negotiations, possibly violence, and in any case great disappointment. The EU should promote peace negotiations. The EU cannot support a unilateral declaration because it would be a breach of the Oslo Accord. It would also be irresponsible because at present Fatah and Hamas have signed a declaration of intent about forming a joint government. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and it is possible that local government this autumn will increasingly be in the hands of Hamas, a terrorist organization. How is that going to bring peace forward?
Thank you very much, Mrs. ESSAYAH. And now, for a minute and a half, Mr. Svensson.
Tack så mycket, herr talman. Om frågan...
Thank you, President. If the question is asked whether we want the Palestinians to have their own state, then all will surely answer yes. Even Prime Minister Netanyahu talks about a two-state solution. But if the question is asked as to whether we want to accept a compromise, then everyone will say yes, because we all know that both parties have to be involved in the achievement of a compromise that would have to be acceptable to both. But do we believe that in the Middle East we're going to get out of this situation if the international community unilaterally decides on a Palestinian state and Israel is excluded from this decision? I mean, really, politics is the art of the possible, President, and I really don't believe that we could honestly imagine that it's possible to take a decision without Israel being involved in these decisions and in these negotiations. And what was said with the Oslo agreements, and what all quartet partners have always said, is that both parties had to be involved in the negotiations. And we always say that negotiations are necessary because we want the negotiations to move the peace process forward. And we believe that when it comes to the success of this peace process, we believe that negotiations are a necessary condition. And when people talk about the 1967 borders, well, really, we're simplifying things. It's not that easy. I think the border situation is rather more complex, and so the negotiations are urgent. Thank you very much, Mr. Koumoutsakos.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, today's debate would be incomplete if we did not mention the very alarming developments of recent weeks in the waters of the Eastern Mediterranean. Tension is running high, and that can lead to a genuine crisis. One of the big reasons for this dangerous situation is the refusal of a candidate country for accession, Turkey, to accept the possibility of a member state of the European Union, namely the Republic of Cyprus, exercising its full legitimate rights to its exclusive economic zone. An extra source of concern is the fact that this refusal is accompanied by public utterances, statements, threats about strong reactions, military reactions, in the event of these rights being exercised by the Republic of Cyprus. Now, do I need to say that this is not in line? The fact is that there are possibly natural resources under the Mediterranean, and this is what at the root of the whole thing. Now, we have a mutual assistance article in the Lisbon Treaty, and I think that if we can't go down that path, we've got to respond in a diplomatic way which is quick and timely and efficient, and we cannot be simply wash our hands like Pontius Pilate when threats are being made against member states. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. We've got 7 requests, but given the time situation, we're only going to take 7. The list is closed. So now for 1 minute, Mrs. Andrikini.
Commissioner, negotiated two-state solution on the 1967 lines is an optimum solution, negotiated solution and not a unilateral declaration. Today many colleagues mentioned this formula and I fully agree with it. Let's imagine that the resolution supporting a Palestinian declaration is adopted in the United Nations General Assembly. But even then, Palestinians will not be able to avoid negotiating with Israel if they wish to achieve peace. None of the core issues, including borders, Jerusalem, refugees and water, will be resolved by a United Nations resolution. At the same time, a strong and very clear signal should be sent to Israel. Tangible efforts towards negotiations and sustainable peace with the Palestinian Authority have to be made, and one of the areas where this has to be visible is by stopping the expansion of settlements. Visible progress, clear concessions are more than necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now 1 minute, Mr. Lisek.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie Komisarzu, Panie Ministrze.
Mr. President, Commissioner, President in Office, much has been said about this resolution of the UN, which is to be adopted sometime soon, about the recognition of a Palestinian state, but I do agree with those colleagues of mine who say that unfortunately that isn't going to bring us any closer to an overall solution of the problem of peace in the Middle East. That is a problem which far greater politicians and diplomats than ourselves have tried for years to solve, so far without success. We all realize that the peace process negotiations are difficult for internal and external reasons. After all, look at the internal situation in Palestine and in Israel. It's not really conducive to bilateral negotiations, but the Quartet, that is the forum that we need to place our faith in. That is where the European Union should channel its efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Lisek. And now Mr. Paska for 1 minute.
Thank you. After a brief period of peace in the Middle East, things are getting hotter. The Palestinians, inspired by the Arab Spring, have decided to take the last step towards founding their independent state by obtaining recognition in the UN. In Israel, the population wants security, lower taxes and fewer weapons. The Israeli government doesn't want to negotiate with anybody and is swallowing up Palestinian land. Israel has never been flavor of the month in the Arab world, and sooner or later it would be naive to think that sooner or later there won't be an armed conflict in that region. We should therefore apply all our diplomatic clout to get both sides to the negotiating table to agree on 2 independent states.
Thank you, Mr. Paska. And now for 1 minute, Mrs. Băsescu.
Vă mulțumesc mult, domnule președinte. În acest moment, prioritate pentru Orientul Mijlociu trebuie să fie salvarea procesului de pace.
At the present time, we have to safeguard the peace negotiations in the Middle East, which are the only guarantee of a lasting solution. That's why it's important for the peace negotiations to resume as soon as possible. Of course, the leaders of both sides will be considering this and seeking to reduce tension. The international community should be involved, and I welcome the involvement of Lady Ashton. Commissioner, could you tell us if there are if there is a possibility of direct negotiations between the 2 sides 18 years on from the Oslo Accord? I hope the spirit of that accord can help us overcome the differences.
Mr. Obermayr. Thank you, President.
Die neue Rolle der Türkei.
Turkey is now the patron of the Islamic world, and Turkey is using this vacuum that's been created by the Arab Spring, and so Mr. Erdogan is now becoming the most popular leader in the Arab world, even though he's not an Arab himself. And at the moment we see a weakening of relations between the Arab world and the West, but also we see a weakening between relations between Turkey and Israel. Turkey has stopped its military cooperation with Israel, and now trade relations with Israel have been undermined, and Mr. Erdogan is threatening further measures. This aggressive approach to Israel is supposed to use Ankara to establish itself as a leading state in the region, but that's not going to help to reduce tensions. I think we must make it clear that Turkey, with its aggressive policy, is obviously a country which doesn't belong geostrategically in the EU, and it's proving that through its behaviour. Thank you very much, Mr. Obermayr, and now Mr. Kukan for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's frustrating to see the stagnation in the peace process in the Middle East.
Izrael i palestińska strona mają
Israel and the Palestinians have diametrically opposed views to the form and content of the negotiations. However, both sides should agree to the continuation of those negotiations. Although the chances of a resumption any time clearly, the 2-state solution should be the basis of any negotiations. Quite obviously, we all agree to the principle of a secure Israeli state, but so should the Palestinians have a right to their own state. I think that the EU's involvement in bringing the Palestinians and Israelis closer together will be a good training ground for the negotiations between the Serbs and Kosovo.
Thank you, Mr. Kukan. And now, on behalf of the High Representative, I'll give the floor to Mr. Dowgielewicz.
Panie Przewodniczący,
Mr. President, Commissioner, honourable members of the European Parliament, today's debate has been a debate rich in many ways and demonstrates the importance of the peace process in the Middle East. I shall certainly pass on the various ideas aired in the debate to the High Representative, because as we all know, in the days and weeks to come, her commitment to this issue is going to be absolutely paramount. It seems to me that to sum up this debate, we can agree together that the European Union should lose no time and spare no effort if we want to support the peace process. That seems to me crucial, and I believe it is equally vital that diplomacy show the way forward in that region, and I believe that diplomacy will bear fruit in the weeks to come, and the role of the European Union in the process will be a serious one. At the same time, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that today we have been talking about other aspects raised by various members of the European Parliament. So let me say a few words about the situation in Camp Ashraf. The High Representative is fully aware of the situation in Camp Ashraf. She has recently held discussions on the subject with member states, noting the sensitivity of the issue, and in particular the urgent humanitarian aspect. Honourable members of the European Parliament should be aware that the High Representative is resolute and determined in her dealings with all partners involved in the issue, be it Iraq, the United Nations, or member states of the European Union. The High Representative will work towards a solution to that extremely delicate problem. I'd like to thank members of the House for the debate. It's not for me at this point to try to sum up such a diverse debate, but I'd like to thank the House for its commitment to the cause of peace and the future of the Middle East.
Thank you very much, President in Office. The debate on this item has closed, and I'm now going to make an announcement. The Socialist Group has requested that someone be appointed for the delegation with the US. They've asked for Mr. Dimitris Rotsas to be a member of this delegation. If there are no objections to this Socialist Group request, this appointment to the US delegation will be confirmed. So we'll now move on to the next item on the agenda. This concerns oral questions to Council and the Commission on the subject of closing the gap between anti-corruption legislation and the reality. And I'll give the floor, first of all, for 2 minutes to Mrs. McAvey.
¿Cuál escaño?
Sure. Am vrut și avem pentru prima oară un mecanism anticorupție al Uniunii.
Thank you very much, President. For the first time we have got a mechanism to combat corruption in the Union. It's our instrument and deserves support in all the Member States. This is what we need to help us out of the economic, financial and confidence crisis. Scandals concerning corruption over recent years, the debt situation of certain Member States have exacerbated this feeling of distrust on the part of citizens. Citizens who are law-abiding, who pay their taxes in my country, Romania, and in all the other Member States. They need to be sure and confident that their hard-earned money is not going into is not flowing into criminal hands and criminal circuits. at the end of the day. When we need to talk about the forms of support which we provide in the Union, we must be sure that those who break the law are punished, irrespective of their member state, and that the proceeds are confiscated so that they can then be put to good use, and so that we can see that corruption is seen to be punished, and tax evasion likewise. Confidence in justice and in the political classes are essential for unity within our Union. If we want solidarity, then we've got to offer trust. And this is what the Founding Fathers were building on, and we need immediate and timely application of this mechanism. The Member States must take this seriously and proceed with due resolve. Measures against corruption must extend to public procurement, financing of public political parties, and all of the monies which has been acquired in this illegal way must be confiscated and seized. This must be prioritised as part of our security requirements. When we talk about budgets, the budget must be compared with 120 billion euros, which is affected in terms of corruption every single year. So thank you very much to the Commissioner, Mrs. Wallström.
Mr. de Jong has the floor for 2 minutes.
Voorzitter.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, we are surrounded by crisis, and this is caused primarily because of irresponsibility on the part of the financial institutions, but other things besides. Recent developments across the Union have been very varied and variegated. It's not just to do with labour productivity. It's that those countries which are not doing well, often there corruption is a major scourge and a major problem. Now, with Commissioner Malmström, we have had a very good dialogue on cracking down on corruption, combating corruption. I welcome the proposal which has emerged from that. Now, can the Commission tell us how important this is in connection with rescue plans for countries such as Greece, or for that matter, Portugal, Italy, other countries? Is there a relevance of this issue there? I hope that the Commissioner will